Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Women and Children First. My name is Sarah Hollenbeck, and I'm the co-owner of Women and Children First. We're one of the last feminist bookstores in the United States, and we're so glad you're joining us virtually tonight for this conversation. Tonight, we are with Maggie Kast and S.L. Wisenberg. We're celebrating Maggie's new book, Side by Side, but Never Face to Face. Women and Children First is now partially open here in Chicago, but we are going to have all of our events remain virtual through the end of 2021. I'm sorry, until the end of 2020. Hopefully not 2021. So, but the store is open for browsing and for purchasing books like this wonderful collection. And with that, let us begin our virtual event as we begin our events in the store with a land acknowledgement. So please join me in acknowledging that the land on which the bookstore stands is the occupied, unceded territory of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Sioux people. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and the rightful owners of the land where you are viewing tonight's event. A good place to start is by visiting nativeland.ca. Thank you. And now a few housekeeping notes. Before we get started, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a handy little book, buy the book box, where you can click that and buy Maggie's book from Women and Children First. Also, there's an Ask the Question box also at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for the authors, be sure to type your question in that box, and they'll answer it at the end of the reading. Now on to tonight's event. S.L. Wisenberg is the author of the short story collection, The Sweetheart Is In, the essay collection, Holocaust Girls, and the nonfiction chronicle, The Adventures of Cancer Bitch. She is also the editor of another Chicago magazine. Maggie Kast is the author of the memoir, The Crack Between the Worlds, a dancer's memoir of loss, faith, and family. She's also the author of the beautiful novel of Three Unsullied Land. Kast received an MFA in writing from Vermont College of Fine Arts and published fiction in The Sun, Nimrod, and Rosebud. There's a little known fact that Maggie might not know herself, is that she was one of the very first people ever to buy a book from womenandchildrenfirst.com. Back when we launched the bookstore's online store over a decade ago, she was one of our first buyers. And so I'm very touched to be hosting this event. I love Maggie as a customer, a writer, and as a reader. And it is so satisfying to be carried by a writer with such confidence. With this collection and novella, Side by Side, but Never Face to Face, there is a gladness to meet again all of Maggie's characters as they weave in and out of her stories. They grow more and more layered, and we better understand their losses, their longings, their beliefs, their politics, their loves, their regrets, and their roots. So please help me welcome Maggie Kast and S.L. Wisenberg. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction, as well as the land acknowledgement. And hi, Sandy.
Hi, Maggie.
Good to here. So as Sarah said, this book is a collection. It's stories and a novella. And as the title indicates, it's about, as a whole, it deals with encounters with the other, specifically about the separations and the closeness that are involved in encounters with people that are different from oneself. So that can be people as near to you as your parents, your children, your partners, or it can be people as far away as the other side of the world, speaking a different language and eating different food. But there's always some tension between feeling that you are really going side by side with other people, but never quite being in complete face-to-face contact with them. So the stories range from 19th century Austro-Hungarian Empire all the way up to the present. And most of them are narrated by Greta, but not all of them. I'm going to start with one that is narrated by Manfred, who is Greta's husband. And it takes place long ago and far away in 1934 in Vienna, when there was actually a civil war for about 3 days. This was within 3 years of the time when Austria was annexed by Germany and became part of the Nazi regime. So there was very close battle within Vienna. And there was a very strong Austro-fascist party that sympathized with Hitler, but opposed him. They wanted to be their own fascist government. And then, of course, there was government parties on the left that opposed them. So this story is, I'm going to read from the beginning of the story. It's called To March With, and that odd title is explained within the text. And I'll be starting at the very beginning. Manfred Schwarz stood at the doorway of a shop in Vienna's central district, just across the Ringstrasse from his family's apartment in the residential area of Mariahilf. 18 years old, big-chested and bold at 6 feet, he knew these streets as well as he knew his own arms and legs. In the distance, he heard the shuffling sounds of boots assembling on cobblestones, growing louder. Voices argued, and he strained his neck for a glimpse of the crowd struggling to organize today's march. Clashes between warring parties were escalating toward civil war, and Manfred had left without telling his Mutti and Papi, who feared for his safety and would not have let him go. A sharp command rose above the muted mumbling, then more shouted orders. Manfred's heart beat against his chest, and his throat swelled with the effort to repress tears of joy as the footsteps settled into a regular rhythm, approaching. The sound of mitmarschieren. Mitmarschieren, to march with. There was nothing like it, to open his eyes and ears to the wonders of the city and affirm his sense of belonging. There was no other word for it either. No way to translate it from his beloved native German into the foreign tongues his studies had forced upon him. With marching, it would never convey the freedom he felt in joining his voice and surrendering his will to the red flag with 3 arrows shooting right through the center, the emblem of the Social Democrats, his people and the faction that held sway in so-called Red Vienna, while just beyond the city limits, the Christian social bastards advocated an iron-fisted nationalism. Soon flags appeared way down the Rotenturmstrasse, bright fabric waving. Manfred stepped back to let the ragged vanguard pass, then fell in step with workers, teachers, party members, and supporters. Joining the cadence of his feet to those who lived by sweat filled him with the thrill of allegiance. A group of musicians joined the parade with drum and accordion, playing the new Austrian anthem, and Manfred's deep voice resounded with lyrics praising Austrian independence, sung to Haydn's stirring tune. Sei gesegnet ohne Ende, be blessed forever, Heimat Erde, Wunderhold, wonderful native land. As the protesters crossed into Josefstadt, students from the Catholic student fraternities of the University of Vienna came out onto the street to heckle the marchers, joined by those living in nearby apartments. Österreicher Wache, they shouted. Wake up, Austria. Join the Fatherland Front. The counter-demonstrators grew in number and began to shout, Bolshevists, go home. Go back where you belong. Soon, they were hurling objects along with the words. First, a pebble landed on Manfred's shoulder. Then a bottle hit the man in front of him in the head, glancing off to shatter on the ground. Are you all right? Manfred stepped around the glass. Hand to his head, the man looked shocked, but nodded and walked on. Manfred's heated blood turned cold, and he clenched his jaw to keep his teeth from chattering. Muti had been right. He shouldn't have come.
Thank you, Maggie, taking us to a different time and place. So a few things occur to me about in this piece about autobiography and projection and point of view. And in this story, you're describing or you're visiting scenes from your husband's life before he met you. I think that's what this is. And I want to know how that story came to you. Did you hear something in your mind, or did you see an image? And how did you enter that milieu?
Well, I've been fascinated by that period, the period of Vienna between the wars, ever since I met my husband, because it was such a period of ferment, of political ferment, of artistic ferment, sexual ferment. It was just really, it's the Weimar Republic time. And it was, a disastrous time because it ended up leading to, Nazis taking over. But it was still a very exciting liminal time, like being on a threshold between two things. But the story is fictional. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure that those things never happened to my husband. Other things happened, but I don't think those things did. And there are things I couldn't have known and that I had to make up. So it's based on research. I mean, I had to look up the Austrian Civil War and who were the groups that were fighting and imagine what might have happened. And some of them, the events that happened later in the story, were inspired by things that he told me. But some of them were not. I mean, there's things in there that he probably never did. And if he had, he probably wouldn't have told me. So it's a real mix based on a person that I knew well, but it is fiction.
And so what was your entry into that milieu? Okay, you'd heard his stories, you knew him, you imagined him, you read, you did research. And so how do you start the story?
Well, it was that word, mitmarschieren, and I did not get that from him. I got it from a guy in East Germany who talked about May Day. He was a real strong communist, talked about May Day, and he said, "Oh, we always go out. We must, march with." And just the way that he said that, and the way that it meant his identification with the crowd, which I also think was a big part of my husband's personality, even though as a Jew he couldn't enter the crowd fully, but I think he wanted to. So, and that's part of his contradictions. So I think that was really my entry point.
So was this an East German that you met while the wall was still there?
No, but we were there because my husband was a physician and did research on psychosomatic medicine, and we went to a conference on corticovisceral medicine, as they called it, and met a lot of people there that were, very involved. And I visited dance schools there. The Palooka Schule, Gret Palooka, who'd been a big man dancer.
So did the story, once you got the march with, did the story just flow? Or did the images appear to you like a movie? Because like some writers talk about how, the images appear, it's like a movie, and your job is just to type what you see and hear.
I wish.
Me too. Yeah.
Nothing that I write is ever like that. It always involves, endless revision and thinking about different ways of doing it, and getting a lot of advice from people like you and my writing group and other members of First Sisters, our group, but also from editors. A lot of help from editors. A lot of suggestions. About what's believable. And it really helps also when I get suggestions from people who don't know me, because then they'll have a different idea about what's believable from people that do know me.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you about revision. In your book, in the novella, at the end of the book, there's a character who says, "Revision hurts, I want all the writers out there and creatives out there to listen, see what you think. Sometimes you have to grab a passage, twist it into shape, then mash it, shred it, sift remains to find what's at the heart. This is very active. It's like it's clay, or an animal even. And could you talk about how you put the book together and what sort of revisions you did, and of the whole book? If you want, or you can break that down, just talk about revision in general in this book.
Well, the stories in the book I wrote over a period of 20 years. So the one that I just read from is new. It's never been published until now. But some of them were really old. So there were different processes for different parts of it. But when towards the end, this book as a whole started by writing the novella. And so that was the new piece, not the only new piece, but an important part of the new piece. But when I finished it and I saw that there weren't too many publication opportunities for novellas, I decided to put it together with stories. And at that point, it was pretty intuitive and spontaneous. I mean, I just took all these stories and put them in the order that they made sense to me, which was not necessarily chronological. And I didn't think too much about it until I took the whole manuscript as a whole to a conference called Writing by Writers that's put together by Pam Houston. It's a not-for-profit that she started. And there I went to a program called Manuscript Boot Camp, and there was just 4 of us actually in one group, and we each were limited to 300 pages, and we each had to read each other's manuscripts entirely. And then Garth Greenwell was the teacher for that. And he wanted to have it be more like a novel. He wanted to know with each story, well, where are the characters that were in the story before in this story? What are they doing now? Why aren't they here? And so that was a major revision that kind of tied the whole thing much more together.
So you moved people into stories that they weren't in originally?
Right.
Okay. Trying to get a unity.
Getting unity and trying to avoid being too informative, like in case you wanted to know, so-and-so is here, But yeah, so he was questioning that all the way through. Based partly on his own experience with the book he was just then publishing, Cleanness, which he couldn't decide, and his publisher couldn't decide if it should be called Linked Stories or a novel. And at that point, they were just going to publish it as a fiction. But I think they ended up calling it stories. But it still is very unified. Yeah, so that part was more intuitive, not endless revision. Although when I first got there, I said, no one else has seen this, so tell me if there's stories I should take out or stories I should put in. And 2 stories went out right away then, and I completely agreed with that. So that was just like instant, on the floor.
Well, to go back to the short stories in the, okay, I'm just reading some comments. There's a little technical difficulties, which we had a lot of in the past couple of days when we were trying to get on here. So I feel your pain. In the first story, you do retell a story from your life, and it's about a tragic event, a car accident in Jamaica with your family. And it's from Manfred's point of view. And I'm assuming he's your husband. You can tell me he's not your husband, that he's a fictional person. But I want to know what it was like to relive a traumatic event from someone else's point of view, and how much was invented, and what was your process?
Well, one of the things that the person might not notice on first reading is that close to 50% of that story is Manfred looking back to his childhood. That aspect of the story was inspired by the death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy. And the way that as he becomes sicker and sicker, the main character, he starts thinking of himself as a child. He says, how could this happen to little Ilya? Little Ilya shouldn't be so sick, And so I thought, well, I wonder if that's what didn't in fact happen to the character that is based on my husband at all. So part of that, a lot of that is about the fairy tales about a giant called Rubitzel. Well, I had heard of him from my husband, but I didn't know any of the stories. So, I had to go to write to a friend in Austria and find out how to get a book of Rubitzel stories, because they didn't have any around here. So I had to go and look them up, and then they made their own with the story. So some of it was memories of his, some of it was memories that I embroidered. There was some Nazi confrontation in it. There was some childhood things that he had told me. So it's a big mishmash, but it is about half of it is looking back to his childhood.
Yeah, no, I have friend who was reading another friend's book, and he actually highlighted everything that was based on truth. And I saw it. It was like, okay, some people do that. But what was it like to revisit something that was traumatic that you actually went through?
Well, it was something that, I really felt I needed to write, I guess, as a way of expressing it. I mean, I don't go for writing as therapy, but it is compelling sometimes to write about, at least for me, to write about traumatic experiences.
Yeah.
And it just felt important. And it gave, I liked writing it from Manfred's point of view because it gave it a little distance.
Yeah. I mean, I believe it's okay for writing to be therapy. It's just, it has to be good writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
don't see any problem with it. Let's talk about another story that you will be reading from in a little bit. It's called The Way It Never Was. And Greta goes back to Vienna with Manfred, or Freddie, and what they assume is the last time. And can you talk about, I don't know how much of this was made up, how much of this was embroidered, how much of this came from an actual event. But can you talk about how you decided to make that a story instead of calling it nonfiction, memoir, a newish term called speculative nonfiction, where you take nonfiction, you kind of speculate about it. So
in some ways it is like speculative nonfiction because that is a trip that we never took. So it is imagining. I mean, the purpose of that story is to take the trip that we never took. I mean, in the sense of the personal purpose of it. But it's also, as I read it over now and I see what I was doing that I probably was not so aware of when I wrote it, it's also kind of liberating myself. It's making myself into a separate person, which is what happens at the end. So shall I read that part, the very tail end of it? Or did you want to ask me first?
I wanted to ask another question, but if you don't mind.
Yeah.
In that same story, Greta says you can't punish Vienna as it deserves, and the city won't open its arms to embrace you. That's all over. And so I wondered if you could say more about that. And what does a country such as Austria or Germany or the US owe to its people that it's persecuted, and to the descendants of people that it's murdered? And is there a connection between the Nazi past and the US slave past?
Well, I do believe
that.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Say your last sentence again.
Oh, is that something you can talk about?
Yeah. Well, I do believe that we as a country should pay reparations to Black and Indigenous people of color. So yes. And I think that Germany has done the right thing in having what they call the Wiedergutmachung, which means make it good again. Not that you can ever make it good again, but that policy is how my son Tom is living as an Austrian citizen. He was able to get Austrian citizenship on the basis that his father was kicked out. So they have done something right in that sense, I think. So yes, I do think that is an important part of it. Now, but in the case of the character based on my husband, I think he was probably more ambivalent than many Jewish refugees were. He still had a desire to be a true Austrian, which comes out in that story. A lot don't go back, and he always did want to go back. He didn't go back before he met me, which is, of course, he was much older than me, so he was already 40 plus. But then he did, and then we went back every couple of years and took the kids, and the kids got to do things that they liked there, like going to an amusement park and stuff. So it became a part of their lives.
I'm going to tell a joke. There's a joke about these German refugees who are in France, and they see the French army practicing, and one of them says to the other, "Our army is much better than theirs." Right, because they're talking about the Nazi army, but they relate so much to Germany, they think it's theirs.
Yeah,
right,
no, I can do that. That's definitely
vaudeville here. Let's have Maggie read from The Way It Never Was.
Okay, I'm reading actually the end of the story, which writers don't usually do, but that part that I felt was the best one to read. So, but I don't think it's a real spoiler. Okay, this is, as Sandy said, this is probably their last trip to Vienna and it's late in the day. The sun is starting to set, and they've just come from a restaurant. The light was changing as they emerged from the beer clinique. The green leaves of the trees became bluer and crowded together in a luxurious huddle. Every day, wherever I am, the light shifts and the world sharpens and deepens, seems to open up and invite me in, said Greta. Crepuscule, said Manfred, my favorite time of day. Isn't it Dämmerung in German? Asked Greta. Same thing, said Manfred, but Dämmerung always sounds to me like dimming. To me, twilight is the beginning of everything exciting that happens in the night. There's nothing like Vienna at crepuscule. Greta took his arm. They came to the Danube Canal, walked out on a bridge, and looked into the swirling, muddy water. The water is caca-colored, said Greta. Wasn't that your mother's word? Viennese mothers were preoccupied with toilet training, he said. Cacania, the empire. I wish I'd seen those satirists in the cabarets between the wars. That's Greta speaking. Manfred began to hum the beautiful blue Danube. The dank odor of decay rose from the river as the lights of the city blinked on, one by one. Crepuscule gave way to night. Distant church bells pealed, announcing the hour for vespers. The city retreated, blurring in the fading light, and the sky turned rose. Manfred raised his arms and took a deep breath. Greta moved away, allowing but not sharing his embrace of the city. She took a breath and imagined the gestures she would invent, the unknown vistas she would embrace. Sorry, I was distracted by the bell. The unknown vistas she would embrace, the undiscovered valleys she'd explore, the ever-changing world where she would find her way, swooping and swerving, angling and adapting into a future, reconfiguring itself even as she breathed. But not yet. She would be with Manfred to the end, keeping his life on an even keel, charming it against disorder, steady and reliable as the brown river. He lowered his arms and she stepped in close to him. The two stood silhouetted, his solid form joined with her spare one to make a single figure. Slowly, shoulders, hips, hands, and filigreed fingers took form with edges sharp as paper cutouts, a red-orange glow between them.
Okay, thank you. That's so good because in that story you resolve the tensions of his dying, her living, his past, her future, by describing his memories and her future choreography. And you end in the present, though it's during a sunset, which parallels the sunset of his life, and it's very satisfying. And you don't have to solve all the tensions and contradictions. You just have to have a moment where you end a story. And I think some people who are starting out with stories like to end by tying everything in a bow, or else, God forbid, and then he woke up, which is sometimes forbidden, I think, in workshops.
Yeah.
There's another piece where I think you're reimagining scenes from the life of your mother-in-law,
Mm-hmm.
and you show the precariousness of Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I wondered if you could read from that.
Okay, so this takes place, this is the earliest historically in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so it takes place, yes, in the 19th century. And the woman who is based on my mother-in-law is a child. And I'm going to read from the beginning of it. It's called Maria in the Heart of Empire. Isidor Emanuel Katz, known by the name Kast, was a Stabsarzt, staff doctor, in the imperial army of the far-reaching Austro-Hungarian Empire. This summer, he was posted to the Czech lands, to the town of Karlovy Vary, which he called by its German name, Karlsbad. On a warm day in June, his 3 children jostled each other as they searched for boots and gathered pails to go pick cherries. Maria, the youngest, was about to be left behind, and not for the first time. Her brothers were always ahead of her, towering over her, drowning out her small voice. "I'll go too," said Maria. "Where's my pail?" Antonia, Maria's mother, put a hand on her shoulder. "You might fall from the tree." "Please, I'll be careful," said Maria. "I'll pick from the low branches." "Watch out for her," said Antonia to the boys, handing Maria a small pail. "Hold her hand and stay near the road. Don't go near the abyss." Legend had it that Makocha, a wicked stepmother, had thrown her child into the nearby abyss that bore her name. "You can fall right in." Peasant women in black scarves and embroidered skirts passed the children on the road, talking among themselves in Czech. "Grüß Gott," they said, deferring to the German-speaking children of the empire. Walter, the middle child and a tease, gave Maria's army a sharp pinch and ran to catch up with Gerhard, the elder, who was striding ahead. His strong legs and deep voice were already becoming a challenge to Poppy. Maria pursed her lips over a trembling chin and walked as fast as she could. "Let's cut through the woods and go closer to town." Walter tugged on Gerhard's sleeve. Gerhard shrugged away. "Those trees don't belong to us, and the woods are full of sinkholes." "Wait for me," wailed Maria. Gerhard walked back to her, squeezed her arm just a little too hard, and hurried her along with a hand between her shoulder blades. "Pick these," he said, pointing to a low branch, and she began, one for her mouth, one for the pail. Walter scrambled up a tree. "Here's a lot." Gerhard found a rich node and began to pick methodically. His bucket full, Walter descended to look in Maria's. "Not much," he said, and emptied her bucket into his. "That's mine," she said. "You took mine. That's not fair." "Prove it." He pressed his hands over her ears and shook her head from side to side, tugged her braid, laughed, and ran on. Maria cried a little and then trudged up the road to Gerhard. "Walter took mine." She showed the empty bucket. "I'll sock the little bastard when I get close to him." Gerhard stamped his foot and looked for Walter. But Maria knew the price of hitting his brother would be a flogging by Isidore, and decided to let it go. There was no way she could recover her stolen cherries, and the world seemed a place without refuge. Her parents ruled from above, and her brothers were pillars of power on each side.
Just as you were reading that, I was just thinking, you talked about there was no way she could recover her stolen cherries. That just seems very resonant with a lot of themes in the book. But I wanted to ask you where that scene came from. Was it made up from whole cloth? Was it a mix of a story you heard in your own experience?
Well, as you know, as a member of my writing group, that story went through ridiculous numbers of versions, including one that was 55 pages long. Now it's about 7. So it's not, no. I mean, the cherry dumplings, yes, because my mother-in-law liked to make those and she taught me to make them. So I know that they ate cherry dumplings sometimes even for dinner. But beyond that, no. I mean, and of course it's historical. They did go around from when she was little to all the different countries in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and she was always part of one of the colonizers, you know. So there, she was, you know, she was the youngest and she was a girl, so she was quite, even though girls had a hard time then, she was quite privileged. But other than that, it's all made up. Oh, but no, when you get to the end, though, some of the idea that she danced at a military ball, I even have a painting that she made that includes herself dancing at a military ball. So that part was based on evidence. But I have a question for you now, if I may.
Okay.
So, you know, I know that you write both nonfiction and fiction, as do I, and you also write poems and plays. And I wondered if you see a difference in how you approach material, if it's going to be nonfiction or fiction or another genre.
I do.
Does it feel different?
It feels different. Yeah. I think it's in a different compartment in my head. Even if it's made from the same heart or nub or nugget. I kind of know that, and I think it's the same thing if I watch a documentary versus a feature film, and I'm not exactly sure what I'm thinking when I watch a feature film based on true events. That might be in the same category as true, or might be in the in-between drawer.
Have you ever written in both forms from a single nugget? Or tried it?
Yeah. As you know, from my long-suffering, being a member of my long-suffering writing group, I read thousands and thousands of court documents about a military trial, which happens to be in the feature film, which I had nothing to do with, called The 24th, which you guys can find online. And it's about a race riot in Houston. And I was so taken by some of the poetry embedded and as part of the transcripts of the trial. I first thought, oh, I'm going to make these into found poems. Mm. And my esteemed writing group said, no, those aren't very interesting. So I am trying to figure out what to do with them. And so it's sort of like you have cherries. You think, are you going to make dumplings out of them? Are you going to make a pie out of them? Are you going to make them the center of your dinner? Are you going to make cherry soup out of them? Or are you going to just have them as an accompaniment? So I eventually made a play out of all the quotation, everything was true. And then there were way, way, way too many characters. So then I started making people up and making composite characters. And I started understanding why people make composite characters, because not everybody is quotable at the same time. You have to give a lot of quotes you have to pick and choose quotes and give them to one person.
So do you have something you can read for us?
Okay, we have a few minutes before the questions start. So you people out there should come up with questions. And I just want to say something, that you and I are side by side, which...
Yes, we are.
But maybe we're also face to face. This is a piece, I'm just going to read a little tiny bit of the beginning, and it's nonfiction, and it's called Notes on Grandmother Russia. And this is how it goes. We are Russian, but not Russian. We left the Russian Empire and didn't go back, didn't look back, because we were not Russian, we were Jews, and they wouldn't let us be Russian. So we said the Yiddish equivalent of tant pis, or so there, and took up our trunks and sacks and went to Alabama. So there. The Yiddish equivalent of tant pis is nevech. Russia did not care. Mother Russia was a large and blue cold mother who had millions more at home she could treat indifferently. Millions living and starving in the blue cold folds of her shawls, dying of cholera and overwork. Mother Russia did not care for her Jews any more than she cared for her unbelievers. Mother Russia could not be made to care. She went to sleep. She woke up and looked the other way. She looked up, sniffing for her next warm bite. We, on the other hand, were already on our way with a few pieces of china and a pot or two and recipes in our heads, in the heads of our women. I say that we left the Russian Empire. It sounds like I was there, back in the dusty or muddy wooden shtetl with its chickens scratching and the potatoes and onions waiting in the cellar. Then on the ship with its smells and roughness, plowing through the Atlantic. But the Russian Empire lived and died before I was born. I say I am from Russia because that is where my grandmother said she was from, and I need a place to be from. Not my birthplace in the US, but a deep, mysterious place, as mysterious as life and death. I need a place I don't know. I need a place in the past that goes back further than I can see. I need to be reassured that I am part of what I see as a thick gray skein of family and pastness. I need to feel, to know that I have a place in a river of family, because I can't float. I can't live just being a person without a crowd of before and after. I need to be moored because otherwise, and that's all I'll read right now.
I
It kind
love
of moves
that.
to, thanks, it kind of moves to the Confederacy, which is for another time.
I love that. It seems to me like it's sort of like a textual equivalent of a Chagall painting.
Oh, thank you.
And I hope that my friend Anna Minkoff was listening to it because she's from Minsk. I think she would love it.
Yeah, I have, like, my uncle's mother was from Minsk. Let's go back. We've got just a couple more minutes, Maggie. And as I mentioned side by side a second ago, when you, in the novella, Greta is a widow and she's thinking about articles she's read about the Hmong community in Door County, Wisconsin, and she's thinking about differences of religions, and she's saying that everybody's the same if you strip away the vanities, revealing what makes people human. If one eats with a fork and the other eats with chopsticks, these customs can cancel each other out, revealing a shared truth, both eat. And then you think we can see each other. She hopes that we'd see each other face to face. And so I wondered how you thought of side by side, face to face, what that means to you in the whole of the novel.
Well, I think of it as a contradiction that is always present in all relationships, whether they are, close or far away. Like, as I said in the introduction, that is, there's never, you never can totally understand another person. You never like totally blend with them or totally see through them. But you're always trying to. You always hope to. So you're always on that path. Whether you're just trying to, you might just be in a like social service agency trying to understand a whole community, or you might be in a marriage trying to understand the other person, or you might be a parent trying to understand your child, or vice versa. So it's the tension between the two. And I think, I did say in the title, but never, but you could say, and possibly, or sometimes,
right. Yeah, you're trying to be face to face.
Yeah, it's a journey.
Right, it's a journey. And it reminds me of like, maybe it's a theater game where people just look into each other's eyes and don't say anything. You're just trying to read their eyes. So now it's time for questions, but none of y'all have questions in that little
we have
box.
to click on the questions to get the questions, right?
I have to click on it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Here we are.
With the first one. What propels or compels you to write?
Let's just see. So there's not very many, so we can answer them all.
Yes.
I would say life. I mean, I was a dancer first, so I think I'm just compelled to make things. And when I made dances, then that was what I made. I mean, sometimes I make food, and sometimes I knit things, and so on. But I like to make things, and I don't think that one form of making is better or worse than another. That's always been kind of. I just do. I don't know. What about you, Sandy? What compels you to write?
I don't know. I'm stuck on an image you had of the food for just a second, because I guess that's why people take pictures of their food, because the food is so evanescent, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's taking pictures of the art of it. What compels me to write? I think I was quiet as a child, and so I started writing, and then I also heard a lot of poetry when I was a kid, so I was writing poems because I liked that. And then it makes me feel like even if I write something that's a good journal entry, I feel fulfilled by it. And sometimes I'm afraid if I make granola or I make bread or something that I'm taking away from my writing. So I do have a hierarchy. There's another question. Maggie, did you make composite characters?
Oh, okay. Well, all the characters in it are composite. I made no effort to write, factually. I think there's a lot of different movements in writing, but today when I was thinking about being asked some of these questions about are the characters based on real people, I thought about 25 years ago when Laurie Moore first published in the New Yorker, people like that are the only people here, and they published it with a picture there. And it was obviously a first person story. I mean, it was obviously a true story about her experience. I don't remember if it was first or third person, but it was sort of just calling a thing what it was, and obviously these stories are based on real people, but they're always invented characters. They have invented experiences, and they do things that I could never know about, and they lived at times when I didn't live, so they're definitely not just personal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Does that?
Yeah, and there's another question that there's a cameo. That Maggie, you seem to be super comfortable with ambiguity, with the not knowing. Is that true for Maggie the person, or just Maggie the author? It's an interesting question.
It is interesting. Well, sometimes I feel that I write to find out. So I guess I am motivated to find answers rather than just living in ambiguity. But on the other hand, I think life is ambiguous. So when I try to be true to experience, I guess I write things that are ambiguous. And I'm happy as a consumer of art. I'm very stimulated by ambiguity. I prefer that to pat answers or cut and dried answers.
I just want to add something. Yeah. I just found out within the last week that a friend of mine does not read the ends of novels because he wants to. So he really likes ambiguity. He wants to come up with his own. Or maybe he doesn't like ambiguity because he wants to create his own.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's another question. How much time did the writing, editing process for Side by Side take? And how does that compare to the previous two books?
Mostly they've been about the same because I published the first one in 2009, the second one in 2015, and the third one now in 2020. So each one has taken about the same amount of time. The only thing that was quicker about this one was getting published, which happened to take place quickly. So that was fast. In fact, it took place so fast that I had already planned to go to that manuscript boot camp. And it had already been accepted when I went. So fortunately, they were very generous. Orson Press was about Orson Books, about letting me revise the manuscript further after they'd accepted it. But the whole process, of course, of writing the collection started in 2000. So that, in that sense, it took 20 years because I'd been writing those stories for a long time.
Right, and it takes your whole life, really. Right.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So you know what? I wanted to ask you about the publisher, Orson Books. They publish work that is broadly spiritual.
Right,
and I wonder. And people are always saying things. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. So I wonder if you could talk about the spirituality in the book. They do actually have conversations about spirituality. The two characters in the novella. But if you want to talk about spirituality in this book or in other fiction that you've read, and what is it?
Well, first of all, I personally am Catholic, but I think a lot of people have been turned off by institutional religion. Certainly, the Catholic Church has sinned as much as any other group, and especially in Austria, where they encourage people to vote for the Anschluss to Germany. So, from the pulpit. So a lot of people, and then people have been turned off by personal experiences with institutional religion also, and not only Catholicism, other religions too. So I'm both religious and spiritual, but I think that my horizons are widening. As time goes on, I got very interested in Hindu stories and Hindu spirituality. And I was very interested in Hmong practice and animism. I think that it really broadens one's concept of what spirit can mean to look at other religions.
Mm-hmm. And it goes back to what you were saying. Everybody has creation myths, that are different, but they're the same. And that's part of the quote that I read, but it's just a part of the quote that I didn't quote from.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to the quote about fiction that we always hear in the specific as the universal. So I think, there's a lot to be said about how we're all different and how we're all the same. There's a question about a writing group. Do you recommend that writers join one?
I think that it's very hard to find a writing group. It took me about 10 years to find the one that I've been in for about the last 10 or more years. So you have to find one that where all the people will be fully committed to it, and where they'll all be able to accept criticism and give criticism and take responsibility for reviewing papers and stuff. But I think it's a very good thing to have a writing group. Yes, I mean, you don't mean you have to. I mean, I know writers in our group that didn't have a group for years and did very well. So you just don't have to have a group. But I think for me, it's been a very good thing. It's essential, actually. And so for a lot of people, I think it is, and it's worthwhile to find the right one.
Yeah, I think so too. Even though we have gone through a lot of ups and downs. And I think there often, the problem with our writing group, I think, is that a lot of us teach. And so we're all trying to be the alpha, or else holding ourselves back from being the alpha. At one time we had a talking stick, which does not work on Zoom. We haven't tried it on Zoom, but I don't know how that would work. And sometimes we have to go back to rules or ask the writer, how would you like this discussion to take place? What would you like us to discuss first? And I think even though many of us are writing teachers, we also like to break the rules and start explaining things, which is one of the first things we tell our students to. Don't start explaining things, just be quiet.
Yeah, just listen to what the group says and don't.
Just listen to what the group says.
And don't talk.
Yeah. Would you like to read the very first page or the very first couple paragraphs? Since you've read the end of a story, maybe we can end by having you read the beginning of the book.
Okay.
Do you have that in front of you?
Yep. So the beginning of The Cry of the Patoo, right?
Yeah.
Or the beginning of the novella?
The beginning of The Cry of the Patoo.
Okay. Okay, this story is called The Cry of the Patoo. Hot blue sky wheeled around, and the crashing sound of metal on stone faded into silence. Where was he? And who? He seemed to be lying on his side. Drops of moisture crawled across his forehead, and the sun beat hard on his shoulder and back. He raised his head to see if it would hurt. Are you on top of me? A voice from below him, then running footsteps and excited shouting voices with Caribbean accents. The world rocked back and forth, then heaved around, and his 200 pounds fell back behind that goddamn steering wheel on the wrong side of the car. Manfred had been driving on spring vacation in Jamaica, 1977. He always drove the car, but why would a whole island want to drive on the left side of the road? He saw what had been under him, now beside him. Greta, his beloved American wife, her white hair turning crimson. Everything else was green grasses and ferns and vines, tangling and twining in the steamy air of the ditch with a gravel-filled creek at the bottom. So I would like to thank everyone that came and entered comments, which I haven't had time to read all of. Yes, the recording will be available, as Sarah said at the beginning. I think she's going to send a link to everybody who registered. I'm so appreciative of Women and Children First for putting this together and taking the time to make all the tech work, which was a challenge. And of Sandy for having such wonderful questions and comments and interesting things to say, and also for sticking with it despite technical difficulties.
Yes.
So I think I think that that's just about all. And Sarah's going to come back and say goodbye and suggest that you buy our books from Women and Children First, and all of Sandy's books too. There's my book, Here's the Adventures of Cancer Bitch. You can buy that from Women and Children First. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'll shut up, Sarah.
Yeah, no, thank you both. That was a beautiful conversation, and I think you covered a lot of territory. Thank you all for joining us and for your questions. And yes, the book is available for purchase with the Buy the Book. And I will email all of you a recording with closed captioning of this event tomorrow. So thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.